It just happened. John Bolton, the former national security advisor who turned against Trump, is now reportedly facing a brutal federal indictment. The media is in meltdown, and everyone's pointing fingers. So, what's really going on here? Let's break it down piece by piece, because once you see the pattern, it changes how you view the entire political system. Now, if you've been following the news lately, you probably heard the headline first from one of the major networks. MSNBC was among the first to break the story. And the way they framed it was pretty telling. They said Bolton, the former national security advisor turned sharp critic of Donald Trump, was expected to be the subject of a complaint or even an indictment as early as the following week. They cited a couple of sources and reported exclusively that the acting U.S. attorney in Maryland was moving forward quickly to seek criminal charges against Bolton. The charges, reportedly, relate to claims that he improperly kept classified national security information in his Maryland home. His home was searched back in August, and Bolton's lawyer immediately insisted that his client did nothing improper. On the surface, this sounds like another political hit job, doesn't it? After all, Bolton has been one of Trump's most vocal critics since leaving the administration. He wrote a tell-all book, gave interviews, and didn't hold back his disdain for the former president. So, when you hear that he's now facing federal charges under a Trump administration, it's easy to assume it's payback. And that's exactly the story the media wanted you to believe. But here's where things get interesting. This isn't something that was manufactured under Trump. This is something Bolton was already facing. The investigation into Bolton's handling of classified documents didn't start when Trump returned to office. It started during the Biden administration. That's a key detail, and it changes everything. Think about it for a moment. If this investigation began under Biden's Department of Justice, then it wasn't born out of political revenge. It was born out of a legitimate concern about how classified information was being handled. Yet, when you listen to the major networks, they're not exactly rushing to highlight that fact. Instead, they focus on the fact that Bolton has been a Trump critic, as if that somehow makes the charges less valid. Just because you're a Trump critic doesn't mean you don't deserve a federal indictment if the evidence supports it. And if a grand jury made up of ordinary citizens, your peers finds that a federal indictment is warranted, then you have to make your case in court to defend yourself. It's exactly what the president himself had to do. And the process is supposed to work the same for everyone. But obviously, the media isn't really interested in focusing on that key detail. They're going to focus on the narrative that sells. And right now, the narrative that sells is that President Trump has weaponized the entire weight of the federal government against his political opponents. They're painting a picture where anyone who criticized Trump is now a target. And the implication is that this is authoritarian overreach. And look, I get why that story is compelling. It's dramatic, it feeds into people's fears, it gets clicks and views, but is it true? Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. During one of the cable news panels discussing this, a commentator brought up a list of people who are supposedly under investigation right now. The list included John Bolton, John Brennan, a Federal Reserve official, a former cybersecurity director, a prominent congressman, a former special counsel, and several others. The commentator presented this as evidence that Trump is going after his enemies. But then something interesting happened. Another panelist, Scott Jennings, pointed out that the Bolton investigation started under Biden, and he also mentioned that according to the reporting, they did find classified material in Bolton's house. That's a very important detail. It's not just an accusation. According to the reporting, evidence was actually found. So, if the investigation began under a different administration, and if there's actual evidence to support the claims, then what we're looking at isn't political persecution. What we're looking at is the legal process working the way it's supposed to work. And that's a very different story. But here's the problem. In today's media environment, nuance doesn't sell. Complexity doesn't trend. What trends is outrage. What goes viral is the headline that confirms what people already believe. So if you're someone who thinks Trump is a tyrant, the headline, Trump targets critic, fits perfectly into your worldview. And if you're someone who thinks the media is biased, the headline media ignores Biden DOJ origins fits perfectly into yours. And the truth, which is somewhere in the messy middle, gets drowned out by the noise. Now let's talk about what happens when the media minimizes or distorts the facts. When you hear that Bolton's lawyer says the documents in question are ones that a longtime government official would have normally had in their home after serving in multiple presidencies, and that some of these documents dated back to the George W. Bush presidency, it sounds reasonable, doesn't it? It sounds like maybe this is just a bureaucratic misunderstanding, not a serious crime. But here's the thing, that defense sounds awfully familiar. When Letitia James and other prosecutors rapidly pursued cases against Donald Trump, they didn't accept those kinds of excuses. They said the law is the law, and if you mishandle classified information, there are consequences. So if they're looking for sympathy now, they're not going to find it. Not from the millions of people who watch Trump get dragged through the legal system. Not from the folks who believe that accountability should apply equally, regardless of who you are or who you criticized. And this brings us to a fundamental question. What is this really about? Is this about justice, or is it about power? Is this about holding people accountable for breaking the law? Or is it about using the law as a weapon to settle political scores? The uncomfortable truth is that it might be a little bit of both, and that's the new paradigm we're living in. Over the past decade or so, we've watched as the political and legal systems have become increasingly intertwined. We've watched as prosecutors run for office, promising to go after specific individuals. We've watched as investigations are launched, not based on evidence of a crime, but based on who the target is. And we've watched as both sides of the political aisle have cheered when their opponents are targeted and cried foul when their allies are. This is the new normal. And whether you like it or not, whether you think it's justified or not, it's the reality we're dealing with. The days when politics stopped at the courthouse door are over. The days when the Department of Justice was seen as an impartial arbiter are over. We're now in an era where every indictment is viewed through a political lens, where every investigation is assumed to have a motive beyond just enforcing the law. And the danger in all of this is that when people stop trusting the system stops working. When people believe that justice is just a tool that the powerful use against their enemies, then the very idea of justice loses its meaning. And when that happens, we all lose. But let's not lose sight of an important principle here. In the United States, we have a system that's designed to protect against exactly this kind of abuse. It's called the grand jury system, and it's made up of ordinary citizens, people like you and me, who are asked to look at the evidence and decide whether there's enough to bring charges. These aren't political appointees. These aren't partisan operatives. These are just average Americans who get called in to do their civic duty. And the idea is that if a grand jury made up of your peers looks at the evidence and says, yes, there's something here, then that's a check on the power of prosecutors. It's a way to ensure that charges aren't brought frivolously, that they're based on real evidence, not just political grudges. Now, is the system perfect? No. Can grand juries be influenced by the way prosecutors present evidence? Absolutely. But the principle is sound. The principle is that justice should be blind, that it should be based on facts and law, not on who you know or what party you belong to. And if we're going to maintain any faith in the system at all, we have to believe that most of the time, most of the people involved in it are trying to do the right thing. We have to believe that when a grand jury indicts someone, it's because they saw evidence, not because they were told to. We have to believe that when a judge allows a case to move forward, it's because the law supports it, not because of political pressure. Because if we don't believe that, if we assume that every indictment is corrupt, that every investigation is a witch hunt, then we've lost something fundamental. We've lost the idea that we're a nation of laws, not a nation of men. And once that's gone, it's very hard to get back. So where does that leave us with John Bolton? Well, it leaves us in a complicated place. On one hand, if he mishandled classified information, he should face the same consequences as anyone else. The law should apply equally. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that the timing is suspicious, that the optics are bad, and that in the current political climate, it's impossible to look at this case without wondering about motives. But wondering about motives and assuming the worst are two different things. And if we're going to be fair, we have to let the process play out. We have to see what the evidence actually shows. We have to trust that the grand jury did its job and that if this case goes to trial, a jury will do theirs. And in the meantime, we should be asking bigger questions, not just about John Bolton, but about the system itself, about how we got to a place where every legal action feels like a political act, about how we rebuild trust in institutions that have been so badly damaged, about how we ensure that justice remains justice even when it's inconvenient for our side. Because here's the reality. Both sides are convinced that the system only works when it favors their team. And that's exactly the problem. When both sides are operating from that assumption, when Democrats think Republicans weaponize justice and Republicans think Democrats do the same, then we're stuck in a loop. It's like watching two computer programs crash at the same time, each blaming the other for the error, neither one willing to debug the actual problem. And the media, well, they're not exactly helping. If anything, they're pouring gasoline on the fire. Because partisan media narratives don't just report division, they reinforce it. They feed it, they profit from it. You turn on one channel and you hear that Trump is destroying democracy by weaponizing the government against his critics. You turn on another channel and you hear that Bolton deserves exactly what he's getting because of his own hypocrisy. And depending on which channel you're watching, you'll hear a completely different version of reality. But here's the thing, neither version is complete. Neither version gives you the full picture because the full picture requires you to hold two uncomfortable truths at the same time. Truth number one, if Bolton broke the law, he should be held accountable. Truth number two, the timing and context of this case raise legitimate questions about whether justice is being applied fairly or whether it's being applied selectively. And most people don't want to hold both of those truths. It's easier to pick one side and stick with it. It's easier to believe that your team is right and the other team is wrong. It's easier to live in an echo chamber where everyone agrees with you and no one challenges your assumptions. But easy isn't the same as true. And it definitely isn't the same as healthy. Because when we trap ourselves in these echo chambers, we stop learning. We stop growing. We stop being able to understand people who see things differently than we do. And that's dangerous, not just for our democracy, but for our own personal well-being. Think about it this way. If you only hear one side of every story, how do you know you're getting the truth? If everyone around you is saying the same thing, nodding in agreement, never questioning the narrative, then you're not being informed. You're being programmed. And that's not freedom. That's just a different kind of control. So, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to do something that's become increasingly rare in today's world. Think critically, ask questions, demand evidence. Don't just accept what you're told because it confirms what you already believe. Be willing to change your mind when the facts change. Be willing to say, I don't know. Or, maybe both sides have a point. Or, this is more complicated than I thought. Now, I know that's not easy, especially when you're constantly being bombarded with messages designed to trigger your emotions, to make you angry, to make you afraid, to make you pick a side and fight for it. But that's exactly why it's so important, because the people who control the narrative, the people who benefit from keeping us divided, they're counting on us to react emotionally instead of thinking rationally. And this isn't just about John Bolton. This is about a pattern we've been seeing over and over again. Think about the names that were mentioned earlier. Letitia James, the New York Attorney General who went after Trump. Fani Willis, the prosecutor in Georgia. Jack Smith, the special counsel. And now John Bolton. What do all of these cases have in common? They're all highly politicized. They all involve powerful people on one side going after powerful people on the other side. And they all raise the same question. Are we seeing justice, or are we seeing political theater dressed up as justice? The honest answer is that it's hard to tell because the lines have become so blurred, because the system has become so compromised, because trust has eroded to the point where people don't even believe in the possibility of impartial justice anymore. And that's the truly dangerous part. Not that John Bolton might be indicted, not that Trump might be targeting his critics, but that we've reached a point where the abnormal has started to feel ordinary, where we've become numb to the corruption, where we shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's just how it works now. Instead of demanding better, because when we accept that as the new normal, we're giving up. We're saying that the system is broken and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's simply not true. There is something we can do. We can refuse to play along. We can refuse to be manipulated. We can refuse to let our emotions override our judgment. But here's where things get really interesting. While everyone's been arguing about John Bolton and whether this is a fair prosecution or political revenge, something else has been happening, something that didn't get nearly as much attention, but might actually be more important in the long run, and that's what's been happening with China. You see, while the domestic political circus has been grabbing all the headlines, the administration has been making some bold moves on the global stage. And whether you agree with those moves or not, they're having real consequences, real effects on the economy, on trade, on America's relationship with the rest of the world. Here's what happened. China sent out what some people are calling a strongly worded letter, and others are calling an outright threat to multiple countries. The message was basically this. Starting November 1st of this year, we're going to impose large-scale export controls on virtually every product we make, and even some products we don't make but control the supply chain for. This affects all countries without exception, and according to the president, this was obviously a plan they've been working on for years, just waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Now, if you're not familiar with trade policy, let me translate what that means. China was essentially saying, We control so much of the global supply chain that we can hold the world hostage. We can decide who gets what products, when they get them, and at what price. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's an incredibly aggressive move. Some would say it's a hostile move. And it puts countries around the world in a very difficult position because for decades, we've allowed ourselves to become dependent on China for everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals to rare earth minerals. We outsourced our manufacturing. We handed over our supply chains. And now we're discovering what happens when you let one country have that much leverage over you. So how did the president respond? Well, he didn't back down. He announced that the United States would impose 100% tariffs on China over and above any tariffs that are currently in place. And starting on that same date, November 1st, the United States would impose export controls on any and all critical software going to China. Now, predictably, the media's reaction was immediate. The stock market dipped on the news, and suddenly every financial channel was talking about chaos, about economic disaster, about how the president's erratic tariff policies were going to destroy the economy. And if you were watching those channels, you'd think the sky was falling. But here's what they didn't tell you. They didn't tell you that this is actually a pretty standard negotiating tactic. They didn't tell you that the president has used this playbook before, starting with big, bold threats to get the other side to the negotiating table, and then using those threats as leverage to reach a better deal. They didn't tell you that just hours after the market closed, the president himself said he actually hasn't canceled his meeting with China's president, which suggests that this is all part of a larger strategy, not just random chaos. And if you talk to actual market experts, people who understand how these things work, you'd get a very different picture. One analyst explained it this way. The president starts with very big threats, things that cause sharp reactions in the market, and then he slowly uses those threats as bargaining chips to reach what he views as a sustainable trade deal. The analyst pointed out that we've seen this exact pattern before back in April, and it worked. The market recovered, deals were made, and life went on. In fact, this particular analyst said something really interesting. He said, the factors that have been driving the market higher for the last several months are incredibly strong. Earnings growth is strong, AI development is strong, the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates, and there's been significant deregulation in the background. All of those things are positive for the market. And after the market had gone up nearly 40% over 6 months, it just needed a reason to pull back a little bit. The China news gave it that reason, but it doesn't mean the sky is falling. It just means the market is behaving the way markets always behave, reacting to news in the short term, but driven by fundamentals in the long term. And here's the key point he made. If anything, smart investors are looking to capitalize on this. They're looking to buy the dip because they understand that this temporary volatility is just noise, not a fundamental change in the underlying strength of the economy. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because it illustrates a really important principle, one that applies not just to investing, but to life in general. And that principle is this: fear clouds, logic, and emotion sells better than reason. The media knows that's scared. People keep watching. Panicked people keep clicking. Outraged people keep sharing. So that's what they give you: fear, panic, outrage. But if you actually take the time to understand what's happening, if you look past the headlines and examine the fundamentals, you'll often find that things aren't nearly as scary as they seem. And this applies to everything we've been talking about today. The Bolton indictment, scary headline. But when you look at the details, when you understand that the investigation started under a different administration and that evidence was actually found, it becomes less about political persecution and more about the legal process working the way it should. The China tariffs, scary headline, but when you understand that it's part of a larger negotiating strategy and that the fundamentals of the economy remain strong, it becomes less about chaos and more about calculated risk-taking in pursuit of a better deal. So, what's the real takeaway here? What can you, as someone who's lived through decades of changes, who's seen political cycles come and go, who's learned not to panic at every crisis, take away from all of this? First, emotion is the enemy of good judgment. Whether you're making decisions about politics, about money, about relationships, or about anything else that matters, you have to learn to separate your feelings from the facts. That doesn't mean you ignore your feelings. It just means you don't let them make decisions for you. Second, question everything. Don't take any news source at face value, including this one. Do your own research. Look at multiple perspectives. Verify what you're being told. Don't outsource your thinking to talking heads on television or commentators online. Your mind is your most valuable asset. Use it. Third, understand that the system only works if we demand that it works. If we accept corruption as normal, it becomes normal. If we accept that justice is just a political tool, it becomes just a political tool. But if we insist on accountability, if we insist on transparency, if we insist that the same rules apply to everyone regardless of party or power, then we can start to rebuild trust in institutions that desperately need it. And fourth, don't panic. Whether it's about the stock market, about political investigations, about trade wars, or about anything else, panic is rarely the right response. Take a breath, go for a walk, get informed, think it through, and then make rational decisions based on the best information you have. Because at the end of the day, that's how you stay free. Not just legally free, but intellectually free, financially free, emotionally free. You stay free by refusing to let fear control you, by refusing to let others think for you, by refusing to accept simple narratives when the truth is complex. So, what do you think? Was Bolton fairly targeted, or is this just another example of political karma? Do you believe the system can still deliver impartial justice, or have we gone too far down the road of weaponized prosecution? And what about the China situation? Do you think the tariffs are a smart negotiating tactic or a dangerous gamble? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's have a real conversation about this. And if you value content that cuts through the noise, that doesn't just repeat what everyone else is saying, that actually tries to help you think rather than just telling you what to think, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what really matters behind the headlines. Because trust me, this is just the beginning, and there's a lot more to